If you've taken Henry's class, if you've done anything in the area of climate change, climate science, you know where we are. And so I give you that disclaimer up front, but we will end on the note of hope because we are in the Catholic Christian tradition, a hopeful people. So to begin the conversation, I think it's important to situate this more broadly within the faith tradition. And here I'm speaking about the Catholic tradition, the Judeo-Christian tradition more broadly. I think doing this allows us to begin to recognize what we're going to talk about with respect to ecology and climate change as integral and essential to the faith. This is not an optional add-on. This is not an addendum. This is woven into the fabric of our faith traditions. And Michael's got this book, Doing the Truth in Love, in which he's got one of the best expressions that I've seen and that I use in my classes. He says that the least inadequate expression, so it's inadequate. We're speaking about absolute mystery. But he says the least inadequate expression for God is 1 John, God is love. And Francis says this. He says, human life is grounded in 3 fundamental and closely intertwined relationships: with God, with our neighbor, and with the earth itself. According to the Bible, these 3 vital relationships have been broken, both outwardly and within us. This rupture, he says, is sin. That might seem strange to talk about sin in this way, but in the Christian tradition, as the theologian Richard Gula says, sin is simply refusing to live out the gift of divine love, the gift that we're called to live vis-a-vis God, neighbor, and creation. So in the Catholic Christian tradition, one of the principles is care for God's creation. I want to emphasize right up front, this is nothing new. This did not begin in 2015 with Pope Francis and his encyclical Laudato Si. This is nothing new. Most notably, Pope John Paul II, in his 1990 World Day of Peace message, emphasized, I wish to repeat that the ecological crisis is a moral issue. This is a moral issue, and this is not new for the Catholic tradition. Why is this? Why is this a moral issue? Well, there are several reasons we can give, and I'm going to give 2 just as initial placeholders for the conversation. The first is because all of creation has dignity and value. As Francis says in Laudato Si, other living beings have a value of their own in God's eyes. By their mere existence, quoting the Catechism, they bless God and give God glory. The other is because we are part of creation. And what happens to the quote-unquote environment inevitably happens to us. So this is Francis in Laudato Si. He says, nature cannot be regarded as something separate from ourselves or as a mere setting in which we live. We are part of nature, included in it, and thus in constant interaction with it. We are creatures. And because of this, Francis goes on to say, we are faced not with 2 separate crises, one environmental and the other social, but rather with one complex crisis, which is both social and environmental. So from an ethical perspective, when we think about loving neighbor, inevitably we have to think about loving creation and all of creation. So ultimately, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, we are called, as we read in Genesis 2:15, to cultivate and care for creation. So this is an ethical dimension. This is one of the 7 principles of Catholic social teaching. This is nothing new for the Catholic tradition. So this is Francis in Laudato Si. Climate change is a global problem with grave implications: environmental, social, economic, political, and for the distribution of goods. It represents one of the principal challenges facing humanity in our day. Action for justice is essential to the Church's mission. Ultimately, and this is the pivot, ultimately as a Christian community, and I would argue as a faith community more broadly, we're animated at the end of the day by hope. And this is how Francis ends Laudato Si. He says, yet not all is not lost. Human beings, while capable of the worst, are also capable of rising above themselves, choosing again what is good, and making a new start despite their mental and social conditioning. Despite the systems and structures and policies we don't even think about, we still have the power and the capacity, and I would say the responsibility, to think differently and to change. As Francis goes on, hope would have us recognize that there is always a way out, that we can always redirect our steps, that we can always do something to solve our problems.